Bom dia. Hoje temos então uma conferência pelo professor James Tuten. Nós, infelizmente, não temos aqui serviço de tradução, portanto, a ideia será, depois da apresentação, que será naturalmente em inglês, depois tentarmos fazer uma discussão também em inglês, com questões colocadas em inglês. Perdido aqui no programa. Okay. O professor James Tuten é professor de História no Juniata College, na Pensilvânia, nos Estados Unidos. Tem um doutoramento em História, feito em 2003, concluído em 2003, pela Universidade de Emory, em Atlanta, na Geórgia. É autor e coautor de um conjunto de títulos. Destaco apenas alguns. Easy Riders and Hard Roads in the Early Recorded Blues. Don't Want to See No More Like That. Climate Change as a Factor in the Collapse of Low Country Rice Culture. Neste momento tem no Prelo, numa coedição com Matthew Lockhart, um livro intitulado A History of Southern Hunting, Essays on South Carolina. Como sabemos, ele é autor de alguns títulos, de alguns artigos relacionados com o consumo do vinho, o consumo e os usos sociais e culturais do vinho Madeira nos Estados Unidos, incluindo este Liquid Assets, Madeira Wine and Cultural Capital Among the Low Country Planters, 1735-1900. Esta comunicação tem o título Critical Acts of Commensality and Cultural Capital, How Madeira Wine Served Social Functions Among Anglophone Elites in 18th to the 20th centuries. So, please, Professor.
Good morning. It's very good to be in Madeira, I must say. At some time in the 1830s, nearly 200 years ago, Silas Weir Mitchell, who was a physician in Philadelphia, and quite a famous one. He was a pioneering physician in a number of different aspects of medicine in an era where people were not so much specialists. He was also from a very wealthy family in Philadelphia, and he was very well connected, right, to the leading sort of quasi-aristocratic families there. And so he took part in a dinner, a Madeira party. And that Madeira, he wrote about it in 1895, published a little book, just 50-odd pages. And in the book, he describes this party. There are 4 gentlemen that take part in it, right? Toward the end, the women of the household apparently return from wherever they have been, and that brings the party to an end. So it was a very masculine world that they were living in and understanding. In his recounting, one of the 4 has very little experience with Madeira wine. And of course that makes for a good what we would say, a good setup, right? Because you have one novice, and therefore it's not strange if the other three go on at length to tell the person all about Madeira wine, right? You need somebody to be the ingenue. And so you have that person. In the early part of the setting, there's a lot of description of the room that they are in to dine. They describe the table, right? And in the description of the table, one of the members says, you might like to know that at this table, Washington, Lafayette, and Franklin have dined. And another one jumps in and says, all good Madeira men, I do not doubt, and that accounts for so much. So that idea is an important one that I would like for you to keep in mind, that as we develop these thoughts in the coming minutes, the idea that I am a Madeira drinker today, but that connects me to these great people of the past who were also had the similar good taste to me. If we doubted that good taste abounded in this situation, then the little details, not just the history of the dining table, but the clock in the corner that gets described, the livery that the butler wears, right? Today we would say there is a good bit of attention paid to the signs of wealth and status and taste throughout the book. Yeah. So, like those qualities, the Madeira party is a wonderful example and a somewhat deep scene of an example that shows us how people were at the same time consuming Madeira wine because they enjoy it, consuming Madeira wine because it creates commensality, which we'll talk about in a minute, and of course, very self-consciously, they're consuming it because it is also cultural capital. So we will consider mostly those last two. I think we will agree that it's good to drink, and we don't have to talk so much about that. All right. I should. So the agenda, right? I will certainly define those concepts, some examples of cultural capital and commensality, a bit more. I do want to make the point about the convertibility of it, which is something I've worked on a bit before, and I will use some examples. And then we'll look a little bit at the long legacy of Madeira. Maybe it's not even a legacy, right? It continues. So this was thinking about our Anglophone elites and wondering, what I could contribute to a conference here in Madeira, lacking good Portuguese myself. And I have worked on, obviously Anglophone sources. This, by the way, is a portrait of Silas Weir Mitchell, and then that's one of the tooled leather copies of his book. It never was a book that was published in large numbers. Each edition that was published were small numbers, but people constantly kept bringing it out. It always, like Madeira wine in the United States, maybe in the Anglophone world, there was not always a large number of people who knew about it or wanted it, but those who did were very willing to pay a price to have it. So the Anglophone elites, as you all know, because of Madeira's unique position in the Atlantic, the British Empire's navy, merchant and military navy, made quite a routine of stopping here. Some of the most famous early voyages of the British Navy brought them through Madeira. Captain Cook, right, who made circumnavigation. He stopped in Madeira. On 2 years after his stop, when he was on the other side of the world, he celebrated Christmas by drinking the last of their Madeira wine, right? And to me, that's sort of symbolic. I have a few other examples that come more from, in a sense, the Anglophone experiences in the Pacific side of the world. But I notice, well, it is worth certainly noticing that while I'm focusing on North America especially, although I've done my research some on both England, Barbados, Jamaica, and Guyana, or Demerara, as they called it, India really was probably, it looks like more barrels, more pipes of Madeira went to India than any other part of the British Empire. They could not get enough of it. So these Anglophone elites do share some common ideas of taste, right? And they share some common ideas of what I think counts as cultural capital as well, even though they speak English with different accents. So my hope here then is to join those different strands of scholarship around commensality and cultural capital and see if we can recognize them interacting when people are drinking Madeira wine. Okay. All right. So just reminders, of course, about the scope of the British Empire in at kind of two different periods, since they misplaced some of their North American colonies at one point. Right. Now, let's talk a little bit about cultural capital. I should say that in designing this particular representation, I was using examples that were relevant for Pennsylvania and the United States, and not all of them would make sense even in all parts of the United States. So it was one I made to explain it to my students, but I sort of had it handy. So, of course, Pierre Bourdieu, famous sociologist, came up with his theory that we can understand humans as interacting around multiple forms of capital. And an essential part of that is that those forms of capital are interchangeable, or they are convertible. So for example, economic capital, euros, right? We all understand that. But there are other forms of capital that, so for example, symbolic capital might be a license to practice medicine, right? The license is not practicing medicine. Merely, you can't sell the license, so it is not capital. You can't in quite that sense. But you can use that license to generate economic capital, right? It is convertible in a sense into economic capital. Likewise, social capital is your connections, who you know, right? And we all know all too well that having the right social connections can lead to positions, can in itself lead to economic capital, and vice versa. And then cultural capital, which has always been the one that interests me the most, because in some ways it's the most abstracted, I think, although symbolic capital is pretty abstracted, right? You could, down the street in the museum with the Flemish art, right? The wealthy Madeirans made economic capital through sugarcane cultivation. How do you show, what do you collect, right? What do you do with your wealth once you've met much more than your basic needs? And often people invest in cultural capital. And in any given setting, right, both in a temporal sense and in a geographic sense, people influence each other. So they did not invest in artworks from all over the world. They invested in a particular, they are existing in a particular moment, and there are particular works that are accessible, and in particular areas that are thriving in terms of art. And that's, it seems, as from what I can tell, what part of what took place here. Similarly, in the Anglophone world, of course, a lot of that capital came from sugarcane, right? Demerara, Barbados, Jamaica, and other crops, rice, cotton, tobacco. Those all generated significant economic capital. What people chose to do with that economic capital is always fascinating. And building big houses, having a staff to attend to your needs were all part of displaying that and living a quality life in their view. But they also attended to their cultural capital in other ways. They bought artwork, they bought wonderful furniture to decorate their homes, and they invested in certain qualities of food, because the quality of food and drink you consume signals your sense of taste. Madeira wine has a very special place in that regard. So at one point in Bourdieu's work, he created a little chart. And well, all I've done here is recreate the chart and updated the examples. So, right? So he understood the axis he had in mind. And partly I updated it because his examples are from the early 1970s. And cultural capital, things move, right? They don't stay in the same place. And they can be specific to different locations as well as time. So something can be high economic capital, expensive, and have high cultural capital. Things, of course, can be inexpensive and still have high cultural capital, right? There are not many things that can do both of those at the same time, but some things. And then you have things that are low economic capital. So I hope that these examples make sense for you, but I will try to point out one. So like fast food in the United States, McDonald's, is not expensive. That is part of its point, part of its success. It has low cultural capital in the United States, and it's inexpensive, right? But there are even things that are considered less pleasant, like if you've ever had coffee at a gas station in the United States, I strongly advise against it. I am confident the worst coffee that can be had in Madeira would be many times better than this. I took the example out here of a product that the United States makes that is sort of appreciated in many parts of the world, American whiskey, bourbon. Right? And there are bourbons that are very cheap and very poor quality. Right? So low economic and low cultural capital. Then there are some that don't have a lot of cultural capital but begin to be more expensive. And up in the upper right corner is a brand of bourbon called Pappy Van Winkle, which is so hard to get. I've never seen a bottle. I've never tasted it, although I have regret. I had an opportunity and I just couldn't spend that much money for just 2 ounces. Right? But you have to have enough high economic capital to have the faith that it makes sense to do that. But there are some things that are low economic capital, right? They don't cost much money, but are esteemed, right, in terms of cultural capital. So an example, at least in the United States, would be home-crafted goods. So something that doesn't cost much because most often it's made in the home, right? So someone maybe makes their own pickles, their own peppers, or makes their own jam, marmalade. Sometimes that's superior in quality and flavor to what one can buy with any amount of money, right? Craft production, right? Craft-produced things sometimes are gifts or no money is exchanged, but they have high cultural capital. All right. So we should discuss commensality as well. So I find that commensality is a bit less commonly used as a term. So part of my teaching portfolio, partly really because of my prior experiences with Madeira, I had worked on the history of rice culture in the southern United States. That led me to Madeira, and at some point it dawned on me that part of what I was doing was the history of food. So I began taking that more, focusing on that as a study. Certainly when I was in graduate school, there was no graduate school in the United States where if you knew you wanted to get your PhD focused on food history, there was no place where you could do that. There are people now that you could go and study with and say, I wish to be a food historian. But it was not yet, the field was coming together. That's probably the best way to understand it. In food studies, the idea of commensality is very important. And in fact, I think it's the most important concept in food studies. A lot of the work on commensality, it's like much in food studies, it comes from multiple disciplines, sociology, anthropology, but archaeologists have done quite a lot around commensality as well. So the idea of commensality, of course, from the Latin, together at the table, right? But the key concept here is that we have to be eating and or drinking together, right? So whether we're eating a whole meal, but it could be we just gather over a social beverage, coffee, tea, wine, something like that. That in the process of spending that time together, it is rare for people to exchange only time, right? They almost always exchange more than that. They begin to develop relationship. Some of those relationships are very brief and they do not develop much. But most relationships, if they are to develop into important relationships, they'll almost always have commensality as a part of it. So the scholars who worked on this, of course, begin with the family. Families dine together, they eat together, and this is some of the source of their connection over time. Other people, to me, I always think of the example of the British pub, right? The British pub is such a big part of, historically, of masculine culture in Britain. Men who otherwise don't interact a lot, but they share a pub in common, right? They go there after work every day, and you see this kind of thing in the rum shop in the Caribbean, for example. They gather every day, they stay for an hour, they have a few drinks, and over time they get to know each other, right? They develop some bonds. Sometimes those become important friendships. Sometimes those relationships are somewhat isolated to that location, but part of what we see is that commensality, of course, is pleasurable too, not unlike drinking the wine itself. So the associations of pleasure, the associations of connection or commensality, the warm feelings between people, and then the sense that we share a common sense of taste, we have common cultural capital, adds up to important bonds for people. So I would give you an example of another of these locations where people built cultural capital, shared commensality. So this is perhaps a little strange, right? Hot and Hot Fish Club. Your English is not letting you down. It's strange to most English speakers too. It's a very peculiar name. The fish club part is not hard, is as it seems. Okay, it was a club that would meet in order to fish, and then they would eat the fish, right? So the fish club, right, makes sense. Hot and hot, it's an idiomatic expression that was either very local or may have even been just a coinage of one of the members of the club, right? Because the idea was they would, at the end of the day, right? So this club, I'll show you where it was in a minute, but in the United States. These were all men who owned vast plantations. So as an example here, I have this gentleman, Robert Francis Withers Alston, and this was his main plantation, Chicora Wood. This is what it looks like today. It was recently restored. But he also owned a beachside house, and he owned 3 or 4 other plantations. He was exceedingly wealthy. He also controlled the lives of several hundred enslaved people. So this fish club, they would bring one servant with them, one enslaved servant each. They would, typically on Fridays, they would gather, and they would get there by middle morning. They would fish until middle afternoon, and then their servants would clean the fish, and they would have a meal of fish that evening. And so, but the way they served the meal is that they would have the first course of fish, right, hot, and as soon as that was done, and hot, right? So the fish would keep arriving at the table, one course right after the other, always hot from the cooking, right? So that was the origins of the idea. And this shows you, this is the coast of South Carolina, and you see Savannah, Georgia, right? Charleston. You know, if you go straight across in latitude from Funchal, you end up between Beaufort and Charleston. Yeah. And then Georgetown, you see up there, and you see Georgetown is a harbor with quite a big bay, and there's a little sliver of land that has a river running up it. That's the Waccamaw River, and that little sliver of land is called the Waccamaw Neck, right? Really a peninsula. And the entirety of that land was owned by these plantation owners, right? In fact, most all of the land around Georgetown. It was the most intense area of rice cultivation in South Carolina. In fact, the most intense area of rice cultivation in North America, in the Americas, for 150 years. And they made an incredible amount of money. They were among the wealthiest North Americans by any measure. So, what happened with this fish club is that they build their own, because it is rural, right? They can't have a gentleman's club like one would in London or New York or Philadelphia. Buy a building and have a staff, and we just go there and have lunch. So it's too rural for that. There are only about 25 members, and these members build a building, and a hurricane comes along and destroys it. And then they build another building, and another hurricane comes along and destroys it. So they went through many buildings. Ultimately, they build one, and the buildings are right on the river, so the fishing is right close. Ultimately, they build a really nice building that lasts for a while. Out of the group, the club begins in the 1820s and lasts until the American Civil War. They had strict rules, right? And the rules were designed around commensality to some degree and around cultural capital. For every meeting of the club, each member must bring a bottle of Madeira. Right? That was just routine. But then you would take turns, right? On top of that, each meeting, some member of the club had additional responsibilities to bring other things to drink, right? Additional wine. And then they had rules that if someone had, say, a new child, you had to bring champagne to share if you have a new child, right? Or if one of your children were to get married, you have to bring champagne to the next meeting. If you were to be elected to a political office, you have to bring champagne for everyone, right? Alston had to bring champagne because in the 1850s he was elected the governor of South Carolina. It was a very politically connected group. In fact, in looking at Alston's, we have a very nice inventory of his wine cellar that was made when he died. His records generally have survived down to us quite intact. And in looking at his correspondence, he would, because again, it's in a rural area, they have business agents that work for them in Charleston. And of course, that's a much bigger port. So, in looking at the correspondence, you can see how important Madeira was in their lives. That correspondence would include, okay, I'm ready, I want you to sell this much of my rice that you're holding, right? Can you pay my taxes for me? Also, I want to buy these 2 enslaved people. Can you pay them, and then we'll make the arrangements, right? All of this business would go through these factors, they were called. And mixed in with that constantly was, give me a pipe of Cercial. Can you get some Malmsey for me, right? Make sure it's a good old one, right? It is among the business acts that he writes about, it is easily in the top half dozen of things he mentions, right? That tells us something, I think, both about its importance in his life and also in the work of these factors. So I'll just give you one interesting example. At one point, he has, this is 1837, he asked them to buy, 1856, he has them buy a pipe of Madeira for him. And he is going to split that pipe in quarters with 3 other men. One is another member of the Hot and Hot Fish Club, a neighbor, also very wealthy. One is the current governor of the state, Butler, at the time. And the other was a man named Wade Hampton II, who owned many thousands of acres of land from South Carolina all the way to Texas, right? One of the wealthiest people in the entire North America. We see there, when you think about it, shared taste, literally shared cultural capital. We all are equals such that we can go into equal shares of the same large barrel of wine. And, in addition, we're equals, right, in taste and status. So I think this binds these people more closely together, right? Again, another part of Bourdieu's idea is that these forms of capital can interchange. So to me, we see an element of social capital. We are bound together, right? As well as cultural capital. We own this special wine. When Alston died, he coincidentally died of natural causes during the U.S. Civil War. And somewhat famously, I've written about elsewhere, when the United States Army troops arrived, typically when they would arrive at these plantations, it was an opportunity to have a good drink. So the first thing they would do when they arrived is say, where's your best rum? Where are your best liquors? We're going to have a drink right here. So they knew that this was what happened, and so they went into the road leading to their house, to that house I showed you a picture of. In the middle of the night, they went out and dug a giant hole in the road. And they had an old crate that had been used to ship a piano to their plantation. They buried the crate in, And then they put in all the Madeira bottles, demijohns, bottles, buried them all into the crate, and then covered it back up. And then acted like everything was perfectly fine as the troops' horses rode in right over the top of it. After the war, right, when they, of course, are, they think they're impoverished. They, of course, still own a lot of land. But they also had this cultural capital, right? Buried cultural capital. And so they dug it up and had the wines sent north to be auctioned off. So they literally converted that cultural capital back into economic capital as a means of recovering from their losses during the war. We see other examples like that. The South Carolina Jockey Club is another club, right? So you've heard of the Kentucky Derby, perhaps, in the States? Maybe not. It's the most famous horse racing event in the United States. Before the U.S. Civil War, the most famous horse race in the United States took place in Charleston. But they never raced again after the Civil War, partly because the Jockey Club was broke and the track was largely destroyed. And also, they rode the horses into battle. Didn't have too many horses. So the Jockey Club occupied, they had a big racetrack right in the city of Charleston. And together, so that, of course, like most horse races, a lot of drinking took place on the days of the events. And they drank Madeira. They had you can tell the priority of Madeira by looking at the amounts that these organizations, these groups owned and the individuals owned. So they would sometimes own some sherry. For whatever reason, they didn't own much port, but they invested in Madeira. So the Jockey Club had hundreds of bottles of Madeira wine during the war. As the U.S. Army approaches Charleston, which is of course where the fighting began in the U.S. Civil War, some members of the Jockey Club decided they would try to save their collection of wine. So the belief was, because the first shots in the Civil War were fired in Charleston, that would be the key target for the Army. So they said, well, we'll take the wine, put it in wagons, and take it to the state capital, which is Columbia. They do. They take it to Columbia, and there they did something clever. They thought, where can we hide wine that no one will look? And they went to the state hospital, which was really the hospital for people who were severely mentally ill. So they went in there, they stacked it all into one room, and then they bricked the doorway shut. In a clever tactical move, the United States Army, instead of going after Charleston, they bypassed it and went to Columbia. They thought it would be less well defended and that it would be unexpected. And they were right on both ideas. So Columbia, much of it burns during the Civil War. But the big brick hospital, of course, did not. And no one ever went to the hospital to look for anything of value. So their collection survived the war. After the war, they moved the collection back to Charleston for a while. There was some hopes of reviving their club. When they gave up hopes of that, they auctioned off the collection. And they used that money to endow a private library society in Charleston that still exists today. So we see in these cases that literal convertibility of economic capital to cultural and back to economic. Here's another example. This is from Savannah, Georgia. So I mentioned about these kinds of factors, is what they were called, which are typically port city, at least in the Anglophone world, especially in the plantation complex. They are kind of these pivotal figures. They rarely own a lot of land. They're shipping. They really have a shipping business, but it's a very full service business, right? And so I'll ship your rice out, but if you need me to bring a piano from Boston, I can arrange for that, right? They arrange for almost anything to be sent out or back in. And mundane things too, such as, can you get me send me 2 barrels of potatoes or something, right? They will handle, nothing is too small, right? Very full service sorts of factors. The Habersham family occupied this space, right? And this photo, this is William Niall Habersham. His ancestors had begun in that work. His grandfather and father set up their own separate one. And here we see his home. And his home becomes famous. So what the family would do is they routinely had their ships stop at Madeira. And the family cared deeply for Madeira wine. So they would add barrels of Madeira, which what was typically not, in the beginning, I think, was not so much that they were trying to make a lot of money from Madeira. They liked it themselves, and they would ship it then to these plantation owners who wished for it. But increasingly, they would hang on to some and then sell some. They closed their business as a result of the U.S. Civil War, and Habersham, both of his sons, were killed in battle in Atlanta. And so perhaps for that reason, he never went back into business again, But in his house in downtown Savannah, there was a ballroom, and he had above the ballroom, he converted that space into what they would call a garret, which was an attic wine space, only good for Madeira, right? Any other wine you would not store up there. And this became commonplace for them that they would store Madeira, up in the warmest parts of their houses. His reputation grew and grew and grew, such that that in the Madeira party, that they talked about, well, who are the most knowledgeable, who has the best palate of Madeira? And this was in Philadelphia, and they said, oh, Habersham. Everyone knows Habersham, cannot be tricked, he cannot be fooled, his palate is too excellent. But also because having bought many liters of Madeira, how then you age the Madeira while you own it, you've now put your imprint on that particular wine, right? Because part of the charm of Madeira in the Anglophone world was that even if you said 1840 was an incredible year for Cercio, once that barrel left Funchal, what happened to it, right? If it's now 30 years old, that barrel has had a lot of additional aging, a lot of additional life. And if that barrel circumnavigated the globe in a British merchant ship, it's worth even more money, right? And then that barrel would be called, would take on the name of the ship that it had sailed in for, if it sailed in a particular ship for several years or more, then that barrel will be the 1840 Cercio, and it would have the name of the ship, right? So it has additional cultural capital from that. If it has other special associations, there was an eclipse that year, or if the owner in the States had a reputation for exceptional care and aging of his wines once he had them, like Habersham, that adds additional cultural capital, and people would pay an additional premium for those wines. Right. When Habersham dies in 1899, his collection is auctioned off. Right. The auction house Christie's in London, certainly very famous in the Anglophone world. The very first auction Christie's ever had, which is in the 1760s, very first auction, they included what they described as some very fine old Madeira. So they've been auctioning Madeira for a very long time. In the case of Habersham, we see in his collection many Madeiras of considerable age, but they include blends, his own personal blends, right? Because as you would get to the end of a barrel, you would have the lees, right? The lees of the wine, and he would make his own blend. So this blend might be, some 1830 Sursil here. He might use a different noble grape and mix with it, right? His palate had such a reputation that, in his case, even the lees that he produced, people wanted them, right? What was usually considered, the dregs is what we would say in English in some cases. All right, I should move on. Oh, I did want to just point out a different facet of cultural capital, because as Madeira grows, right, you begin to have Madeira parties, it becomes more ritualized. One of the things that happens, of course, is it begins to matter what other things you attach to your Madeira drinking. So what kind of glassware are you going to use? This is happening all over Europe, of course, at the same time. The 17th and 18th century, the idea of having to own more and more kinds of glassware specific to the thing you're going to drink from it. Decanters and tickets, right? So I have a few other ticket examples. In the 1700s, especially the 1800s. So in English, these are called wine tickets, to hang on the bottle or on a decanter. And so I think this is 1810s, 1830s, and the third one. So these are both made in Britain, silversmiths in Britain. The final one there, I like, because there are many, many examples. These are all from the Victoria and Albert Museum. The third one there is from India, a silversmith in India, and they had a pretty broad date on it, but 1870s. Those are 2 tiger claws, right? So that's made from tiger claws and silver, but a reminder of the importance of Madeira in the India colonies of Britain. In the early days, of course, they change over time. I won't go too deeply into that. But it's a reminder that you display, when you choose which of these to have, you're displaying your cultural capital as well, right? In a small way. Things got in the way of Madeira. My sense is that people on here are very aware of oidium, and of course that's what phylloxera looks like on grapevine. Terrible. The American Civil War, as I've mentioned multiple times, is of course a great like all civil wars. It's a great trauma. It's a financial trauma, social trauma in the United States. And one result of it is that those Southerners who would use wealth gained from enslaving people, they do not have that kind of wealth. They cannot continue to import Madeira the way they had. But outside of the South too, in Philadelphia, Boston, New York, all of those principal harbor cities, it also slowed down for a number of reasons, I think. The trauma of the war, of course, the world wars stopped exports from Madeira as well, and the United States, in what I assume must be on your top 10 list of strange things the United States ever did, went through about a decade of prohibition, right, in the 1920s to 1932, in which case no legal alcohol is imported. But prohibition changed American drinking habits as well, and that was the point, of course, and the popular memory is the ways in which it changed drinking habits in favor of illegal alcohol, and especially it moved it towards spirits, right? So coming out of Prohibition, beer and spirits are much more popular, and wine is much less popular in the United States for really until the late 20th century, I would say. So that changes behaviors, but Madeira does not go away, right? People, after all, continue occasionally, not on the scale of a Habersham or an Alston or the Jockey Club, but occasionally some old family collection would come up for auction. And through the entire 20th century, in Savannah, there was an organization called the Savannah Madeira Club. The Savannah Madeira Club, to circle back to a point I made very early on, they are aware that they are descendants, in a way, of William Nile Habersham of Savannah, right? But also of Mitchell, who wrote the Madeira Party book, right? So this photograph, unfortunately, was not a very good quality photograph. And this was them gathering to celebrate the U.S. bicentennial in 1976. This was the logo that they had made. And you will probably, this of course is Duke of Clarence drowning in a butt of Malmsey, which is a somewhat famous thing. And I think Blandish has one of their blends is called the Duke of Malmsey, Duke of Clarence blend. Perhaps no one was ever so famous for such an unusual act. So they would meet and they would give historical papers. They wore black tie. Yeah. In the 1960s, they got a new member. His father had been a member. Part of what happened is they had a generation who were reaching the end of their lives, and so they had to bring in younger men. And these younger men included a fellow named Mills Lane Jr. He was born in Savannah, right? So he's a member. His father had been a member. He really lives in Atlanta, and this is the time period when Atlanta, Georgia is starting to really grow, right? Really become an important economic city in the United States. And he is the president, and his grandfather founded a bank, and he is the president of the bank that is the biggest bank in the U.S. South at the time. So very influential in Atlanta, the kind of person that when there's a crisis, the mayor calls him to say, what do you think about this idea? Very important person. And he was crazy for Madeira. Very self-consciously saw himself as a continuation of Habersham and Alston and Mitchell, right? That they're all connected through time. They share these tastes through time. And he collected a great many Madeiras. And they had some remarkable experiences at this club. For example, the 1960s, 1970s is when underwater diving, with the scuba diving, we call it in the United States, with the tanks, right, is starting to become something that popular. And that means there are lots of shipwrecks that no one has ever dived on. So there was a shipwreck called the Able and the Savannah River, and a couple of friends of members of the club, they dived on that shipwreck around 1970 or so, and they pull up a bottle of Madeira that's still intact. It's buried in the mud, buried enough that the cork had not broken down. And they get it up, the stenciling is still on there. They know they've got Madeira. So they have a party focused around tasting that Madeira that had been at the bottom of the Atlantic for about 100 years. No one said it was the best Madeira they ever had, but they all said it was quite drinkable. So when Mills Lane dies, all of his wine collection, well, first, every member of the Madeira Club was personally given, his son gives each of them 4 bottles of old Madeira from his collection. That was in his will, right? To me, that's also says some things about social and cultural capital and commensality, right? I've got this wealth, but I'm remembering my friends, right? The rest of his collection was shipped to London, and Christie's auctioned it off. Among their Madeiras back to the 1700s in his collection, right? So this is around 1990 when he dies. So those are old Madeiras. But perhaps one of the most wonderful ones, and it illustrates that unique way cultural capital can happen, I think, with Madeira in some ways more than any other wine, is that he had one bottle of what in the States they're called the Emperor Madeira. So this is from 1850, well, it's an even older, I think it's a 1790s vintage, but when Napoleon is brought through, right, Funchal on his way to St. Helena, the British consul discovers that the emperor has no wine to take with him, and that seems wrong for a Frenchman. So he gets a pipe from Blandish, and they put it on the ship, the Northumberland. It is never drunk, never tapped at all before the emperor dies. Maybe the most remarkable part is that in dispersing the emperor's things, there was a very keen sense that anything that Bonaparte owned was of great value. Now it has great cultural capital. And so how to distribute the things he owns, became part of the story. But someone felt like since Blandish had provided it, that it should come back. And so they brought it back to Funchal, and eventually the company bottled and sold off those bottles later in the 19th century. So that kind of item is nearly truly unique, right? Drinkable, but almost like a work of art. When it is gone, though, it is gone. And to me, I think that is the sort of thing that Madeira has captured for centuries for these Anglophone drinkers. They love the wine. The wine sets the table for commensality for them all. It builds these bonds. But an aspect of those bonds will always be the sense that you and I share common cultural capital. We recognize this kind of quality. We have the knowledge of how to drink it, take care of it, what to collect in the first place. So you might say there's a very positive reinforcement over time in the procuring, collecting, and consumption of Madeira. Ward McAllister was a very famous New Yorker. And he was, in my mind, my wife did not like it when I said this to her, but he's sort of a social influencer, we would say today, right? He really was making a career in New York of defining who are the most important people in this city. This is late 19th century into the early 20th century. So he literally wrote the book that said, here are the 400 most important families of New York City. Right? And he loved Madeira quite a bit. And he opined ultimately that while all of the wines could be good socially, in the end, that Madeira is the poetry of wine. Right? And I think in that sense, he captured a feeling that many of these folks had. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this very interesting conference. I'm sure our audience has several questions. So, any question?
Congratulations for this magnificent communication. I would like to ask about another use of Madeira wine. Is that they only drink itself, the Madeira wine, because it also is using fruit for making sauces and other kinds of uses, not only for drinking for itself. So, did you find
Yes. So the question was about how in the United States one of the functions of Madeira becomes especially for making sauces, and that is quite true. So from time when I've given talks in the United States, or just even in conversation, when someone asks me, well, what are you currently working on? And I would say, I'm working on Madeira wine, and you could see them think for a second, and they say, that's the stuff you use in sauces, right? So in the 20th century, except for a relatively small group, it became really synonymous with a wine used for specialized cooking situations. French cooking. I mean, there's a whole interesting thing about how the French got interested in Madeira, which appears to have happened when the French helping the United States, what was hoping to be the United States during the Revolution, some of the Frenchmen, because why would you import wine to France, came to the U.S. and they would be at these events and they started drinking Madeira, and they said, this is quite good, and then they supposedly began having it imported to France. Fortified wines have declined a great deal in appreciation in the United States in the 20th century. But both in England, there's a understanding that the Madeira replaced sherry as the preferred fortified wine in the Anglophone world, and then sherry kind of replaced Madeira again, and then port replaced sherry. Sherry ended up with sort of the reputation in the Anglophone world as it's a very kind of old-fashioned drink in a sense, which is that's not good cultural capital to have. But the fortified wines, if you go to the States now, in many places, that you can tell they are an afterthought in most wine stores. And most people have their primary connection to Madeira is for cooking.
Thank you so much for your so interesting, because some ideas to talk with my students.
Oh.
But I have a question. It's about generation, social consumption, evolution.
Yeah.
Because you present here different generations, and I believe that in 18th century this is a sophisticated way to make a selection of the best people, high social position. But have you any idea about if the Madeira immigration has some influence in these clubs? That means these clubs, they receive Madeira immigration elites in their inside the club, or is always a selective way to say, well, we are the true American or English or French, because it's interesting. The last in 20th century, when you present the image, I believe that may be something different. This is the first question. Second is, why, the question is, if you, in this club, you found the information about Madeira wine and Porto wine, because, maybe the exportation of Porto wine to England and to Europe is higher than, but it's interesting because sometimes in this symbolic hierarchy, because this is a capital, always a selective process, maybe Porto wine is connected, but in these inventories that we talk, there's no information about that.
Okay. I will start with your second question, I think, and then go back to the first. So those inventories, sometimes they will have some port. In the 18th and 19th century, though, it's more likely they would have some fine sherry. So for example, the auctioneers create a catalog. Now they do it on the web, but that's part of the sources, right? They produce these catalogs for the auction, and those catalogs are in a sense an effort to market cultural capital, I would argue, right? The descriptions, but they have to say up front what's being auctioned, and so it will say things like a rare, unique collection of Madeiras and sherries. So Habershams, I don't remember. I'd have to look to be sure. I don't remember more than just one or two ports, but his collection was probably 90% Madeira and about 9% sherry, 1% port. And that for the 18th, 19th century, that seems to be how their valuation. The Jockey Club also had it. Theirs was Madeiras and sherry, but it was probably more like 60, 70% Madeira, 20 to 30% sherry. And again, not much port. Now that's the auction catalog, and they also own demijohns of rum, but there's no need to auction those things so they don't show up in the catalogs, so the sources are biased toward the things of higher value. So the 20th century, I think as we get there, you see port showing up more often, just in general, and I think into the 21st for that matter. It's certainly the more common fortified wine to find in the States. Yeah. So then the first question was it also about whether Madeiran migrants, people who immigrated from Madeira? That's a great question. I have not seen that. I would say these clubs are heavily biased toward people whose heritage was England and France. Some had German heritage, a little bit, but really mostly those two countries, especially 18th and 19th century. 20th century starts to be more complicated, and I have the list of all of the members of that Savannah Madeira Club, but I didn't think about asking that question of it. I was sort of more interested in their rules and behavior and that kind of thing. But it's a good question. Thank you.
I think all the people that immigrated were from low class.
Well, certainly, a lot of these folks were elites. They're second or third generation as successful capitalists. But there is certainly in this time period quite some fluidity, right? Some people do make considerable wealth in a generation as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your very interesting talk regarding Madeira wine. My first question is regarding the first book that you presented to us, The Madeira Party.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's consider that as a literary fiction because at least it has a setting.
Yes.
And it's three guys that know about wine, one that doesn't know, so let me show you and tell you about it in a written form. So let's call it a tale.
Mm.
And what is the objective of that tale? It's like to influence others to drink Madeira wine, is to show them that we are superior in that sense that we drink Madeira wine. It's this kind of civilization process that we're dealing with.
in that sense. That's my first question. What is the objective of that book? The second one is regarding a bunch of your examples. So you show us through several examples that these people value the economical capital of that wine. But for us, it's intertwining in the sense of we see cultural and economical value in the same sense, or at least from your presentation, you see it that way. But do those people understand the cultural value of it? Like, do they talk about the importance of being Madeira, or do they talk about that, or just for the economic value of the wine? Because when they bury it, to save it from the ransacks, they are just thinking of the value of it and the possibilities to save it after it. So do they think about the cultural aspect of it? Thank you.
Good questions. Thank you. So to take the first question first, the purpose of the tale. Obviously, I've spent some time thinking about that. Because it is a curious little book, and it's also curious that people kept buying it and it kept being reprinted to me, because it comes out in 1895 at a moment when Madeira wine is supposed to be fading in importance and recognition in the United States. When I first bumped into Madeira, the way I was researching these rice planters using, their papers really was what I was interested in, because the sources are very biased in that direction. And I would bump into things like, here's an inventory of Alston's wine cellar. And I would, just mildly curious. It wasn't germane to my topic at the time. And it would look at this list and it would be, say, these words I did not know. Malmsey and Cerciol and Verdelho and Boal. What in the world kind of wine is this? And then you would go to the next set of papers in the archives, and there would be another example, and they would the same words again. Of course, this was just before the internet, so you couldn't just take out your phone and look it up. So I think that in some ways speaks to the degree to which common knowledge in the U.S. around it went down. So I think it's curious that the book was so successful, but the book also. I think it's hard to read the book today and not notice we would say supercilious. I don't know if that's a word that people, self-satisfied, right? There's a profound sense of self-satisfaction in this book, that the four diners are very, they are very proud of who they are. They are quite convinced that really no one could be better than these four people in this room. And so discussing the fact that Jefferson and Washington Lafayette dined at this table, that's just further evidence of how important that they are inheritors of that sort of status, that sense of taste, that elevated sense of taste. So I would say in the book is definitely meant to educate people about Madeira and about the fact that Madeira has this history in the U.S. That's clearly, I think, part of his goal to write it, is to express a kind of admiration for the wine, but the wine's place among the elite of the United States for a longish time. Longish time by U.S. standards, 100 years at that moment. But so I think that is what he is trying to do for sure. And then your second question. I think I sort of folded some of the answer into that. They definitely, they are self-aware that Madeira, that knowledge of Madeira wines is specialized knowledge, right? So Bourdieu would say that this is part of cultural capital. For something to have high cultural capital, it has to have some specialized knowledge associated with it. So collecting art always is an example I like, because it's not, right, that you could collect art based on going to an auction and just trying to get the most expensive piece of art. and say, right? But that's almost the definition. That's the kind of act of nouveau riche, yeah, right? Right. So if you're trying to show taste, you need to know what you're collecting, right? So it's not enough to have the money. You need to be able to demonstrate you have the esoteric knowledge in a specialized area. That's not the area in which you make your living, I think is another important part, right? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor. Excellent lecture. You've talked a good deal about masculine world, memory, construction of
Yeah.
memory, we would say the creation of memory, taste, wealth, status, a little bit like a pretext for sociability, conception, minority consumption, bonds. What I would like to ask is this. All of these men with their sources, was Madeira wine at hand to make socially drinking a little bit more acceptable? Trying to put, I don't know, alcoholism at bay? And was it also a way to keep things religiously also accepted?
Oh, interesting. I hadn't thought about the religious context very much. That's an interesting one. I have to think about that part. I mean, certainly most of these men espoused religious views of various kinds. So that one's harder, and I might defer to a later point trying to answer that question, but maybe I didn't ask the right questions of the sources. But the other idea about drinking, there's a small separate literature, partially separate literature, on the drinking habits of the founding fathers' generation in the U.S. Right, the U.S. is a little obsessed with right. You win one big war and you think you've won them all, but because they drank quite a lot, and they would go in and talk about the Declaration of. They were drinking rum while they're writing the Declaration of Independence, and then they would take a break and go to a tavern, and get a big bowl of punch, and have drink punch for a while, and then at supper they're like, well, let's cap it off with a couple of glasses of Madeira each. So they drank quite a lot, and I would say by our standards, unhealthy amounts, for sure. So I suspect that, yes, one aspect of the Madeira is that by ritualizing drinking in certain circumstances, it maybe helps create some limits. Now that said, at the end of the Madeira party, one of the things is that one of the folks is pretty wobbly when he tries to get up to leave, And in fact, the very last line of the book has one of them walking off into the night, and he's sort of singing an old English drinking song to himself. It tells and that's partly about this idea that he feels really good and all that, but it does suggest that they're right at the edge of having self-control and so forth. A piece that's harder to tell is how often that is happening with the founders, because people, when they're creating the Constitution in the U.S. or those kind of meetings, people kept journals, and so we know a lot about that we know a lot about their eating and drinking from their journals. It's funny because sometimes what they didn't keep notes during their actual formal sessions, or they didn't keep formal notes, I should say. So some of how they compromised to make deals is actually lost. Maybe they compromised and made deals because they were drinking Madeira. Perhaps. perhaps. But it is clear that they went through a tremendous amount. Years ago, I calculated when Thomas Jefferson was president, he had two terms, 8 years as president. And back then, you didn't have a lot of the hosting was out of your pocket. The presidency didn't pay much money at all. And the idea was, that was the cost of serving your country, is that you would have to, out of pocket, you'd have to host many people. And I calculated that he spent nearly $50,000 US just on Madeira during the 8 years of his presidency. Just hosting parties, having people, and it was clearly the preferred thing for him to serve. So.
A simple question. Do you have any reference of people then getting together, and we are speaking about very healthy people, to make a journey to Madeira, to in local try the flavors of Madeira?
I'm not sure I totally caught it.
If you have any reference that people came here to taste.
Oh, I see. I'm thinking. I'm not.
Mainly between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of the Second World War.
Right, because by that point we're moving the fewer sailing vessels, so you wouldn't have to come in the way that that makes to me. That makes sense why that would be the period to ask. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but I do know that the Savannah Madeira Club, Mills Lane. I don't know if he personally went, but I might be able to figure that out by looking back at his materials. But he was pushing the club. He became president of the club because he was the great Madeira collector. He was the richest member and the biggest collector. And he clearly kept saying to the club, let's take a trip to Madeira together. That was in several people's accounts of things. So they were clearly thinking about it. That would have been 1970s into the early 1980s. So fairly recent. Yeah. But the group, as a group, they did not make that trip. But the idea clearly was there, which is the start, I guess. I'm not sure about earlier. I would suspect that I would suspect if I went hunting, I could find it. I just would think some of them would have done it. But I didn't ask that question, and this is the terrible thing. Afterward, you realize you should have asked different questions.
Bom, temos que terminar por aqui. Muito obrigado. Thank you very, very much for this presentation and this discussion. And we'll have a 15 minutes break, 20 minutes break.
Obrigado.